Morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Global Insights, a live, interactive, weekly, streamed panel discussion which sheds light on big questions currently facing policymakers, planners, and researchers worldwide. Global Insights features experts from leading institutions of international affairs, including the Balsillie School of International Affairs here in Canada, the American University in Washington, D.C., Konstanz University in Germany, Warwick University in the United Kingdom, the Institute of Strategic Affairs in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Today's live streamed interactive production is entitled COVID-19, War, Peacebuilding, and Conflict Resolution. My name is Fitz-Gerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School, and I'm delighted to be moderating today's session. Warm welcome to all participants in the audience, and we have many of you today. We would ask that if you have a question for the panelists, you direct that through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we will do our best to channel those questions to the appropriate panelists, especially towards the latter part of the session. We're privileged today to host 5 very well-known scholars on issues related to war, peace, and conflict resolution. Charles T. Call, better known as Chuck Call, is an associate professor of international peace and conflict resolution at the School of International Service at the American University in Washington. His research focuses on post-conflict peace building and state building, conflict prevention, policing reform, and fragile states. He is widely published and was the senior external advisor to the World Bank UN report on preventing violent conflict, also the senior advisor in the State Department between 2012 and 2014. Solomon Ayala Dersso is a well-known legal scholar and a peace and security expert and the founding director of Amani Africa, an Addis Ababa-based Pan-African policy research, training and consultations think tank working on African multilateral policy processes, focusing on the African Union and its Peace and Security Council. He is a regular commentator on all international media outlets and is widely published in his field. Timothy Donais is an associate professor in the Department of Global Studies at Wilfrid Laurier Universities in Waterloo, Canada. He teaches there in the field of peace and conflict studies. He also serves as a director of the Masters of International Public Policy program and co-director of the PhD program in global governance, both at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Anthony King is the chair of war studies at Warwick University. His most recent book, Command, was published last year by Cambridge University Press. He is currently writing a book on urban warfare in the 21st century to be published by Polity next year. He's advised the armed forces for over a decade. Julia Welland is an assistant professor of war studies and an early career Leverhulme fellow at the University of Warwick. Her research uses a feminist approach to ask questions about war, violence, and militarism in global politics. Thank you very much to all the panelists for joining us from different corners of the world today. I'd like to kick off right away with a general question which focuses on the COVID outbreak and the impact of this on international peace and security. So Tim Donais, tell us about your views on the pandemic disruption, and whether or not this will accelerate or disrupt trends in international peace and security.
Thank you, Anne. I'm actually doing my best to try not to embrace my inner pessimist through all of this, but I think there are a couple of important and worrying trends I think that the pandemic is likely to accelerate. The first is around fragility. I think the coming years are going to be a real stress test for many states, with potential for the resurgence of the kinds of social unrest that we saw in many states last year, places like Lebanon, Chile, Haiti, Sudan, although already it seems like last century given how time passes in the middle of a pandemic. But I think beyond the public health dimensions of the pandemic, it's in fact going to be the indirect impacts that are at least as troubling. It's already clear that the coming global recession will deeply affect the poor and the marginalized, especially in the form of disrupted livelihoods and diminished food security, lockdown borders may further increase domestic social pressures, as will, lest we forget, the continuing effects of climate change. And all of this, I think, is likely to exacerbate domestic social cleavages. We've all seen what's going on in the United States, but there's already been in other parts of the world, including the Central African Republic, some episodes of targeting and scapegoating of minorities, which is a bit of a worrying trend. So I think there is significant potential for a number of states to tip over into, or in some cases exacerbate, existing civil conflicts. The second concern, and I'll be more brief on this one, is around disengagement. I think it's very likely that important donor countries will be preoccupied with domestic issues, protecting their citizens, protecting their economies, to the detriment of international conflict management and resolution over the next several years. So I think the pandemic then is likely to add to downward pressure on resources for things like peacekeeping and peace building, at a time, in fact, where they're likely to be more needed than ever.
Thank you very much. Solomon Dersso, let's turn to you. You're coming in today from the Horn of Africa and focus on Pan-African issues more generally. What are your concerns about the dynamics of peace and conflict going forward?
Thank you very much. I think there are a number of issues that we need to take note of. For us on the continent, and some of the outcomes or the adverse effects of the pandemic would be exacerbating existing fragilities. Countries that have already been affected by conflict would now have to have another front to fight in order to contain and prevent the spread of the pandemic. And that would add a lot of pressure, not only on resources, but also on very limited capacities that these countries have. And that may create further vacuum for exacerbating existing, existing tensions or conflict, particularly in conflict-affected countries. And we have seen already this unfolding in some of the conflict situations, be it in the Central African Republic or in the Sahel, or even in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab has intensified its attacks, exceedingly impeding humanitarian activities in the country. The other dimension has to do with the socio-economic fallouts, not so much COVID itself, but the socio-economic fallouts, I think would have very serious consequences, not only in exacerbating existing fragilities that have been indicated, but also in creating new ones. I think there is a great deal of worry that the economies of many countries would be in depression. Sources of incomes of even people in the informal sector have been affected tremendously. Remittances have been affected, and this would have quite very severe consequences. And I think it would put a lot of countries in a test. I think the major fear in this context is that over the past couple of years, we have seen that major forms of conflict events on the African continent have been what we call protests and riots. These have become the most dominant conflict events on the continent. And we would see these kinds of events, I think, deepening. I think the last point that I wish to add is the impact that this situation would have, particularly for countries in transition such as Sudan, South Sudan, and finally for electoral processes. I think if calendars are not going to be observed, and if existing fragile consensus on electoral calendar is going to be affected, I think that is going to add another layer of fragility as well.
Thanks very much. Over to you, Tony King. You write about war and major interstate conflict. Is this more likely as a result of COVID or not?
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a critical question, actually. I mean, if you look historically, I think the answer becomes quite interesting. I mean, there's no real historical evidence that disease plagues cause war directly. I mean, if you look at the really famous plagues throughout history, you know, the Athenian plague of 430 BC, Black Death 1348, and then the Spanish flu 1919, 1920. I mean, these terrible afflictions didn't cause wars, and so I'd be skeptical that COVID will directly cause wars. However, what I think is pretty clear, and from what Solomon and Chuck have already said, I think we can expect increased tensions, geostrategic political tensions, as a result of COVID and as a result of the economic stresses it's going to put on the globe. And I think in that context, I think it's you know, a possibility of interstate war is increased. And of course, the key theatre here, the key rivalry here would be the great powers of the USA and China, and already you can see certain trajectories in place, namely that China look very much like they're going to come out of COVID in a relatively stronger position than America. America's handling, we all know, has been deeply problematic, and that would suggest that there'll be increased tension between those two global powers who are already vying for supremacy and hegemony in the Pacific region and elsewhere. And we might add to that the deep concern about some maneuvering by China during the COVID crisis, the confrontation in India the other week, literally last week, the new laws being introduced into Hong Kong, and also their potentially provocative acts towards Taiwan with the World Health Organization. So what these incidents together suggest is that there is likely to be an increased level of tension late 2020 going into 2021 and into 22. Now that doesn't mean there is going to be an interstate war, but I think the conditions are increased by the effects that COVID will bring about.
Thanks very much. Julia Welland, these tensions and the international security agenda, what are your views on that? Okay,
Sorry,
you're on.
I'd like to answer this just thinking kind of more broadly around what COVID might mean for how we think about the term security and what that means. So amongst policymakers and certainly within academic circles, we've long spoken about human security as opposed to military or state security. However, as researchers have consistently pointed to, if you look at the way in which economic and material resources are distributed on a global level, it's clear that while human security may be been recognized as a real quote unquote thing, that it's far less of an imperative. It continues to be far less of an imperative compared to state and military defense budgets. So what I think COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic does is that in the face of this global health pandemic, it's going to become harder and harder for governments to make the case to continue to invest in as heavily as they do in things like militarism and things like defense, as opposed to ensuring that things like public health care are adequately funded. So perhaps trying to think quite optimistically, the coronavirus pandemic perhaps offers us the opportunity to rethink what the term security might mean, and to rethink it in terms of how people actually experience it, or indeed how people actually experience insecurity, which more frequently than not may not be as tied so tightly to ideas around defense and militaries.
Thanks very much. Chuck Hall, you look at conflict. What about other wider grievances like horizontal inequities, corruption, authoritarianism? How did these sorts of grievances move forward post-COVID?
Good morning, thank you. Yeah, I think that I want to be pessimistic, but maybe not excessively pessimistic, I think. Tim already mentioned a number of risk factors, I think, for armed conflict, especially internal armed conflicts. And I think it's clear that great powers are, in this crisis, going it alone more than they are cooperating through multilateral institutions, which we'll talk about more, I'm sure. The trends towards state sovereignty versus multilateralism are continuing. I think we've also seen some trends toward authoritarianism in governance, not everywhere, but in certain areas. Obviously, we have limits on assembly that are understandable. but I think those, some of those will be short-lived in most places. I think I'm more concerned about the attacks that some leaders, like in Sierra Leone and El Salvador, the presidents have used this crisis to basically try to consolidate power, attack democratic institutions, limiting press freedoms. In some countries, like Brazil recently, limiting press freedoms that really undercut access to health data that's really threatening people's lives, as well as has the right of access to information. So those are some of the things I'm worried about on that front. The other thing I want to mention is food insecurity. Building on what Tim said, I won't go at length, but I think climate change combined with people who have been confined and unable to get to work fields or transport food could really become a serious problem in the next year or two in particular. So I think that's something that is less visible, but perhaps most widespread in terms of a risk factor. Corruption is something that I think really needs more attention. We live in a moment where lots of people around the world are basically are very upset about are more vocal about their intolerance of corruption than maybe ever in history. At the same time, we have presidents who keep getting elected that are notably corrupt. And so that disjunction between political outcomes and people's discontent is very visible. But this crisis in places like Honduras and Brazil, we have basically governments that are passing these huge packages of assistance that oversight and accountability is less than what has existed for usual government revenues. And so I think that could lead to people being upset. I don't know that that's going to lead to people in the streets necessarily, but it could. The last things I'll say are sort of the racial and class impact of this disease. So, you know, in Sao Paulo, for example, blacks are dying at a 62% higher rate than whites are in Brazil. And so there's a greater impact in terms of deaths, in terms of access to health. And I think that actually has the potential to put people on the streets, as Solomon mentioned, because of a sense of grievance that's around identity. And I think if there's one bright spot I'll close with, it's the fact that I think that some anti-science populist authoritarians who've rejected the seriousness of the health crisis seem to be in some political trouble. Bolsonaro is the clearest example here. So maybe a good point there.
Thanks very much. Let's look at the roles of armed forces and international organizations in managing the pandemic and the aftermath moving forward. Tony King, how might the National Armed Forces be affected by COVID-19?
Well, I mean, in terms of if I stick precisely to the actual COVID, I mean, later on, I'd like to talk about the subsequent effects with sort of the budgetary implications. But I mean, in terms of the effects, I think they've been quite interesting. Namely, that what has been noticeable, firstly, is in some cases the great vulnerability of armed forces personnel to COVID. You've got large barracks or large ships in which COVID can spread, and of course, famously, we've had these two examples, two aircraft carriers, Charles de Gaulle and Theodore Roosevelt, both of which had massive COVID outbreaks. And it is interesting that it's on those ships, 5,000 people's ships, so they're absolutely perfect petri dishes for the disease. So that is interesting. But of course, the armed forces themselves are pretty much the demography of the armed forces is extraordinary as an organisation, in that 70-75% of the people are below 30, and they are healthy, fit, and in some cases extremely fit young men and women. So they're more or less, in the serious sense of the term, they're more or less invulnerable to the longer term, to the serious effects of coronavirus. So in terms of the immediate disease effect on the armed forces, it's pretty limited. Now, what has also been interesting is the way that they have been taken up by states to manage the crisis. And this has been really noticeable in the UK, where our public sector has struggled quite badly and where we don't have a gendarmerie. And there, the British Army have performed, very well in terms of setting up these ad hoc Nightingale hospitals. That's not borne out globally. So the People's Liberation Army in China has not helped at all. The Italian army has done a little bit moving coffins in Bergamo, tragically. But so how would you conclude that the armies have been moderately affected by this, like to be slightly affected over the next year? Doesn't look like they're going to take a major role in crushing the virus itself. I think as we go on with the discussion, what has already been discussed and what will be discussed further is is the longer term, short, medium and longer term effects on the armed forces, which I think is going to be profound, actually.
Julie Welland, thank you, Tony. What are your views on the role of armed forces?
So far in the UK, where I'm based, the coronavirus pandemic has very much been framed in a very kind of militarized language. So at least in our media, we're often talking about waging war against the virus. We're talking about our frontline, our essential workers been frontline, been on the front line of this virus. So there's definitely a very kind of militarized framing around the virus itself. As a feminist and peace researchers have kind of shown for decades, often when we militarize something, we can actually end up increasing the risk of violence or exacerbating the trauma in it. So while I think as a publicly funded body, the military certainly has a part to play in helping to support the national and international efforts at controlling and stopping the virus. And again, just looking to the UK, things that Tony has already mentioned, the army has been, or the armed forces rather, have been involved in our national testing regimes. They've been involved in delivering PPE equipment and so on. And I would very much, on a personal level, I would want to support that. However, on a personal level, I would also want to resist perhaps some of the culture or some of the more militarized approaches becoming embedded in the ways in which we confront what is at heart a health security issue rather than a military security issue.
Thank you. Solomon Dersso, you advise the African Union, you advise all the regional organizations on the continent. What advice are you giving them in terms of regional responses? What are your sentiments about how we can manage this regionally?
Well, I think this very much is associated with the kind of impact that COVID has and the kind of demand that it puts on states. Obviously, this is the continent where COVID started a little bit late, and therefore has given a bit of time in terms of being aware of the kind of impact that COVID has elsewhere in the world. And from that perspective, therefore, in terms of taking early response. But at the same time, we also live in a situation where the health sector is very weak and therefore not anywhere near to withstand the kind of morbidity and mortality that contracting COVID may cause. And therefore you have to invest much of your response measures on prevention. So the initial advice within the AU and to member states was basically for them to act quickly, proactively, and invest in preventive measures, which relate to mostly taking the form of the public health information, particularly those relating to hygiene, relating to hand washing, relating to those kinds of things. I mean, keeping distance and so on and so forth. Obviously, these are not easy things to do on account of the fact that there are large sections of the population for whom some of these things are a luxury in terms of access to water, in terms of access to sanitation, in terms of also the housing conditions where you wouldn't be able really to keep social distancing. So that is really the first part, as much as possible, invest in prevention, which means that you need to reallocate resources, such as for distribution of water and other sanitation measures, and also enabling people, therefore, to have that possibility. And that's one. And the other one is obviously, it ranges from and very important is in terms of having access to diagnostics, therapeutics, and so on and so forth. I think that is where regional action becomes extremely important. I think as many countries, including developed countries, start hoarding these medical supplies, then accessing these supplies, even on a market value, became extremely impossible. So as an individual country on the African continent, you wouldn't be able to at all mobilize or have access to that. So trying to create a common platform for purchasing and procuring these diagnostic, that's one of the things that the African Center for Disease Control and Prevention is doing. The other thing is basically mobilizing support around particularly personal protection equipment and testing capacity. That is what has been done, for example, in terms of the call for that kind of support that was mobilized through the collective action of countries. And the other one, of course, relates to how do you deal with the resource pressure that this puts on countries, which would mean, coupled with the level of debt burden, then you would not be able to do some of the mitigating measures that you can take in terms of economic and fiscal stimulus or support measures that you can provide for those sections of society that would be heavily affected either by curfews or by lockdowns, as happened in South Africa and in many other countries. And what that means is basically you need to get to make an arrangement and engage in negotiation collectively with international financial institutions, with bilateral creditors, and with private creditors as well. Those are the kinds of things that I think from the side of the continent that we have been engaging in, including the mobilization of the PPs and so on that I mentioned earlier on from JACMA Foundation, and then that being distributed through the Africa CDC and the Ethiopian Airlines, basically bringing in some of youth-based institutions on the continent for providing that support to individual countries.
Thanks, Solomon. I'm going to come to Chuck now. You've advised the UN, Chuck, an organization that's been accused of being quite quiet and slow to respond. What is the role of these international organizations?
Yeah, I think that, in theory, in principle, global crises require global responses and produce greater multilateral cooperation. That really hasn't happened in this case. It's happened a little bit in terms of the extent to which the World Health Organization, has a greater profile, and some countries are relying on it to a greater extent. But the dysfunction that we've seen among the great powers, particularly China, Russia, and the United States, since 2014 has not been overcome. This has not been a moment in where there's a recognition that it's time to start reaching and collaborating and cooperating. The US withdrawal from WHO is serious, and another sign that American leadership on multilateralism is dissipating or gone. The other thing that I think is happening is economically, as Tony or somebody mentioned earlier, the industrialized powers are looking increasingly inward to make sure that their supply chains are covered and they're not vulnerable to a global pandemic like this in the future. And I think that is that's going to have economic consequences that will be far-reaching. China is looking inward, and it's suffering from people withdrawing from their reliance on China as well, right? I think we're likely to see a weakened UN in the future, one where there's no single great power that's going to have a controlling interest, as occurred in the 1990s. In terms of the UN's response, I think there's grounds for the criticism that you mentioned, and for the slow response, etc. And there's simply a weak response. That there's not people who are listening, even when the Secretary General has become a more powerful and visible voice on global responses. States are generally ignoring that. The last point I'll make is I think the financial consequences for multilateralism are very, very important, equally important as the political ones. So the UN in November, the month before coronavirus hit, was facing a $1.7 billion shortfall, looking at not paying people. A third of the countries of the UN were in arrears, and then coronavirus hits, right? The other thing what I was trying to finish was to basically say that the consequences for economic assistance and social programs can be very far-reaching, and that will be devastating for the responses that we need to things like climate change and the food insecurity that we were talking about earlier, right? The next question that we had thought about talking about, what are the implications for peacekeeping? And so if you don't mind, I'll just talk about the implications for peacekeeping here before turning to some of the other colleagues. And I think, you know, in terms of its response to peacekeeping, the UN was initially focused on a couple of things. It was focused on ensuring that it itself would do no harm, and also on protecting its own members from minimizing their vulnerability to the virus, right? So specifically inside headquarters at the UN, there was a lot of discussion about preventing a repeat of the cholera tragedy that happened in Haiti, where Nepalese peacekeepers came in 2010 and infected 7% of the population of the country. Eventually got cholera, and almost 10,000 people died as a result of it, right? And so I think there was, and they've been pretty successful at that. So as of a couple of weeks ago, only 137 cases of COVID were among the 100,000 peacekeepers around the world, and only 2 peacekeepers had died, right? That could change at the end of June when 80,000, maybe up to 80,000 uniformed personnel do their rotations, which have been delayed because of coronavirus. So a couple of more effects of peacekeeping, I think. One is that it's changed the way that peacekeepers interact with the population. So in South Sudan, where there's a protection of civilian mission with tens of thousands of people in camps, the government has set up checkpoints that impede the movement of the UN, which has undercut their protection capabilities. The guidance from the UN has been to basically minimize movements and contact, but the core missions of protection of civilians and doing patrols continue, but under rules that keep them more distant. 2 more things. One is that I think the most, again, I go back to the financial impact. The financial impact of the 2008 recession was the cut peacekeeping budget by like 20%. This global recession that's coming up is probably going to cut it even further. And so that could have some serious consequences for protection of civilians in places like South Sudan and CAR and DRC, as well as the counterterrorism and efforts in Mali, right? It's also, we should just remember that peacekeeping has not really been used to address some of the most acute crises on the planet, like Syria, Yemen, and Libya in the last several years. One final bright spot, which I'll say, is that the crisis may help spark the UN, which is famous for its like Luddite technology, to get more updated in terms of being online and doing electronic communications that are where its intercommunicability is improved. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Tony King, your views on the impact on peacekeeping?
It's Chuck there. I mean, I agree with his concerns completely. I mean, there have been some in the immediate sort of, you know, we're in the immediate phase of the virus now, and there have been some de-escalations of conflict. So, you know, famously, you know, in Colombia, the National Liberation Army, the dissident group in the FARC, have announced a ceasefire in response, partly in response to coronavirus. You know, and so, you know, there are moments where there's some optimistic news, but I must say, overwhelmingly, I think the prospects for peacekeeping, even where peacekeeping has been or might be possible, i.e. in the lower intensity or conflicts that are already partially resolved, is not brilliant. And I think that some of that's political in terms of exactly what people have said, that states have understandably, if not admirably, they have understandably turned inwards, but also just on a budgetary front. I mean, if you look at the major, even the major military powers, the UK is facing a GDP cut of 11% in the coming year, China probably 7%, US probably 7 or 8. That will immediately impact upon military budgets. And if Julia's right that more budget will be put to health, social services, you've got a very significant contraction, and that will be multiplied in the poorer countries that have tended to take on the peacekeeping duties anyway. So I think there's going to be a political and budgetary lack of will and interest and capability in terms of future peacekeeping 2021, 2022. And remember, the tax remittances are going to be reduced very significantly in that period, as well as the global recession, depression, however bad it gets. So I think the prospects of peacekeeping, both politically and in budgetary sense, are actually quite fragile, notwithstanding the sort of slight bright news from Colombia.
Thanks very much. Tim Donais, what's the future of peacekeeping look like in your eyes during and after COVID?
I won't repeat what's already been said. I agree with both what Anthony and Chuck have mentioned. I mean, I think in the immediate future, we're likely to see a considerable level of mistrust between peacekeepers and the peace kept, some of which will be, as Chuck mentioned, in South Sudan, will be manipulated by host states for their own political purposes. I think the UN is terrified of a repeat in 2020 of what happened in Haiti in 2010 with the cholera epidemic. So I think over the medium term, we're likely to see a future of socially distanced peacekeeping, which in some ways is actually quite sadly ironic given the recent push coming out of the Hippo reports and other forums towards this idea of people-centric peacekeeping with a greater emphasis on community engagement and on protecting civilians, right? Trying to get peacekeepers out of their armored personnel carriers into the community. I think we're actually likely to see considerably less of that for the foreseeable future. I think civilian staff, as Chuck might have mentioned, are likely to be confined to their field offices for the most part. Military will be engaged in hermetically sealed patrols. So I think peacekeeping is going to be is going to look different in ways that are probably not all that promising in terms of some of the promise we've seen in recent trends towards peacekeeping. All of that is going to be compounded, I think, by, as both of the previous speakers mentioned, by the continuation of this sort of peacekeeping downsizing, right, where missions are asked to do as much as they've always been, right? They still have these Christmas tree mandates, but they're going to have fewer and fewer resources to be able to do that. So the gap between capacity and expectations will continue to be wide.
Thanks very much, Solomon. I want to come over to you and ask you about conflict resolution. And there's questions already from the audience that are looking at internal processes as well and heavier approaches and what measures might be in place. They ask to roll these back once COVID is not over, but perhaps less threatening. So internal conflict resolution and external resolution. You mentioned South Sudan, there are many others. Over to you.
Yeah, I think perhaps if I may pick on the discussion on peacekeeping, I think obviously there are a couple of peacekeeping missions which are on drawdown. One relates to Sudan, and we are going to see the replacement of UNAMID with a UN political mission, and UNAMID's timeline has been extended on account of COVID to the end of the year. That is one point. The other relates to obviously to Somalia, and there I think the worry or the concern is there is already a timeline for the drawdown of AMISOM. And however, if things are going to be exacerbated on account of COVID, and with Al-Shabaab taking advantage of the situation, not only in terms of the misinformation campaign, but also actually in terms of intensifying its attacks, then the question would be, if we are going to continue with the scheduled drawdown of AMISOM, then how are we going to deal with the exacerbation of the fragilities in Somalia, short of or without, or with the continuation of the drawdown of AMISOM? I think that's an important point. Another one relates to what's happening in the Sahel, particularly in terms of the ad hoc coalitions in the Sahel, whether it is relating to the multinational joint task force in Lake Chad Basin or the G5 Sahel. I think there have been reports within the AU that some of the countries have to pull back their militaries from these engagements in order for their militaries to provide support for their COVID-19 response measures. So this is one way in which the COVID-19 situation has affected some of the existing engagements. In others, such as in CAR, where in 2019, 14 armed groups have signed a rather fragile peace agreement with the government. In terms of the implementation of that peace agreement, there had already been a very difficult and challenging environment, and this has been further exacerbated, although there were a few armed groups that also announced that they would actually comply with the call from the Secretary General as well as the EU Commission chairperson for a ceasefire. But those, even among those groups, some of them have gone back to fighting now. And the engagement of the AU and the region has been hugely affected, and which means that, you know, the AU with the UN have been undertaking joint missions to these countries. Timelines in Sudan, timelines in South Sudan as well are going to be affected in terms of implementation of transitional processes as well.
Thanks very much, Solomon. Julia, talk to us about militarism going forward. And, you know, there's a lot of questions coming in from the audience about reconceptualizing the international security agenda. How does this impact on militarism?
Okay, so I think building on some of the comments I was making earlier, I think what's been quite interesting about the coronavirus pandemic is we're increasingly seeing more and more politicians and more public kind of narrative around this idea that militarism might not be the kind of cure-all solution that it's oftentimes presented as. And as I said earlier, I think this has the potential for us as analysts of security, of policymakers of security, to kind of pause and think differently about how we want to conceptualize security, how we want to conceptualize peace going forward. So I think one concrete global action that should be taken immediately is the halting of weapons and international arms transfers, in line with the UN Security General's call for a global ceasefire. And I think my internet actually cut out, but I think this was actually something that was picked up on by Eva or Tim and Chuck. But both the Campaign Against the Arms Trade and Amnesty International have released statements in the past few days in which they've stated that there's a very real risk that arms, that rubber bullets and tear gas that have been manufactured in the UK have been used against the peaceful protesters in the US against George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matters protesters. So I think it really crystallizes, a moment like that really crystallizes just how self-evident that a militarized response to a peaceful protest, to racial injustice, whether it manifests in the kind of unequal effects that we're seeing Black people experiencing coronavirus, or racial injustice in terms of police brutality in the US, but across Europe as well, is that there really, a militarized response there really isn't the correct one in which we can begin to work towards a more socially just, a more peaceful society.
Thanks very much. Tony King, you write on urban warfare, and we've got some questions coming in about some European countries, a state of emergency, prospects for these countries to roll back, relinquishing the emergency powers, and what, you know, organizations like EU, NATO can do about this. Can you talk to us a bit about those subjects?
Well, I mean, we're entering into a broad swathe of debate there. I mean, do I think, one, that the EU will be capable of reining in Poland and Hungarian authoritarian regimes that have traded on COVID? I'm very sceptical about that. The question then that leads also is, how are regimes going to deal with potential urban and civil unrest following COVID? So we've talked a little bit about interstate conflict and civil wars, but if we go down to the next level of civil discord, urban unrest, urban conflict, you know, will authoritarian regimes be able to deal with it? Will democratic regimes be able to deal with it? And I'm actually quite skeptical. I think cities globally, including in the global north, are in a fragile position. I think once the recession, the COVID-inspired recession/depression kicks in, I think the possibilities of serious urban civic disorder are pretty high, actually. And we all talked about the contraction of security forces. So I think one of the key questions facing governments, authoritarian ones and democratic ones, will be the question of civic order. And the answer to that seems to be there needs to be some serious planning by especially democratic regimes, of which we're lucky to be part, in terms of partnership with urban areas and social services to urban areas, and perhaps radical informal partnerships. Look at Rio at the moment. Who is enforcing the quarantine in Rio? It's Comando Vermelho, the Red Command, the super gang in some of the favelas. So I think that going forward, obviously I would support a democratic, liberal regime in terms of civic order. And I think some partnerships and a great attention to the urban domain will be required.
Chuck Call, people from the audience are asking how realistic a civil war in the US might be. Would you like to take a stab at that?
I think, I mean, the short answer is I think that's unlikely, but we've already seen quite a bit of unrest here. And I don't think it's, I don't necessarily think that the Black Lives Matter movement and protests that we've seen in the last 2 weeks have been tremendously important here. I don't necessarily think they're related causally to COVID, but the combination is interesting. I think this is really, as someone who is chair of a master's program in international peace and conflict resolution, I think this is our moment. I think we need to actually look at some of the lessons and learning that we've had from around the world and see how that's related to what's happening in our own countries, and certainly in my country. I think that is the challenge that's right in front of us right now that we're really trying to respond to. And I think that maybe more than the COVID actually might lead in the United States to thinking more about dramatically outside of the box, demilitarized, demilitarizing approaches to public safety, as Julia has talked about, I think, in some of the biggest sort of implications of this crisis, but also the Black Lives Matter movements might actually impact global thinking, might open the thinking towards demilitarized approaches to national security and state security as well, because it's actually been quite important here. I don't know how short-lived it's going to be. It might be short-lived, but I think really, as we talked about, I mean, one of the examples I have is, there's lots of countries that have actually gotten rid of their police forces as a result of civil wars and peace agreements. This is something I've studied quite a bit, over a decade ago. And there's lots of lessons about that and about what other alternatives exist. And we also need to think about the kinds of skills of people that we are going to have helping with public safety in cities and localities that draw on conflict resolution skills and conflict resolution approaches. And I think it's really, it's an exciting time.
Thanks very much. Tim Donais, questions are coming in about drawdowns of peacekeeping missions in countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo and also UNAMID in the Darfur region of Sudan. Questions also are being asked about whether or not we will see more political missions as opposed to peacekeeping missions going forward. Your views?
No, I mean, I think that's a logical extension in some ways, the political shift to political missions of the downward budgetary pressure on peace operations, and I think there's both a risk and an opportunity here. I mean, I think in terms of reducing peacekeeping missions, obviously in terms of things like protection of civilian mandates, there's a risk that if it's done for political reasons, geopolitical reasons, rather than for reasons of the security situation improving on the ground, there's a risk that you'll see a significant return to violence. On the other hand, the transition between peacekeeping and peace building is also crucially important and often gets neglected, right? I mean, many of the missions in Africa, the MONUSCO mission, the DRC being most prominent, I mean, they are conflict management missions. I mean, there's very little momentum towards an exit strategy in terms of the DRC that looks like sustainable peace rather than simply withdraw of the UN. So I think, I mean, we talk a lot about the crisis of peacekeeping. I think there's also a crisis of peace building, and maybe this is sort of picking up on some of the things that Chuck has mentioned. I mean, we are in an era where the liberal peacebuilding model seems not to be working anymore, but we haven't really shifted to another model that seems to be offer superior promise in terms of outcome, right? The Hippo report talked about the primacy of politics, but I'm not sure the international community as a whole has really embraced that or really understood what that means in terms of actually helping countries that have been in long-term civil wars actually find a sustainable exit strategy that leads to long-term peace. So I think there is, as Chuck said, there's real opportunities there, but there's enormous challenges as well.
Thanks very much. Solomon Dersso, over to you. Questions coming in about the local infestation, the floods, drought. You're entering the rainy season where you are, food security, and also economic nationalism. So, you know, how do you see these dynamics coming together as a threat towards peace and security, or the steps towards peace and security in place?
So I think in terms of the issues relating to economic nationalism, I think it looks like that one of the phenomena that we have witnessed, perhaps globally, is one of basically countries looking inward and, you know, shutting down their borders. That is a similar phenomena that we have witnessed in this region as well, affecting potentially intra-region trade and movement. I think one of the things that emerged is basically to make a distinction between the movement of people, which is critical to restrict and control, and the movement of goods and services. I think you might have heard about some of the issues affecting, for example, the East African Economic Community on account of the divergent approach to COVID-19, with some countries like Tanzania saying, actually we are free of COVID-19, and the other countries basically raising, you know, concern and trying to block their borders even for movement of trucks for trading purposes. I think it has to do more with these issues, but at the same time, I think over the course of time, since March, when countries started imposing lockdowns, imposing curfews, and declaring state of emergency, over a course of time, if you go to SADC or if you go to IGAD, there have been conversations among the leaders of these organizations about how we should continue to maintain trading activities. Now, that requires obviously coordination in terms of the kinds of standards that you need to have over border control. And truck drivers have been identified, for example, as being, you know, a target. Uganda announced that, you know, the COVID, one of, you know, the source of COVID-19 into Uganda have been truck drivers, for example, apart from returnees from outside of the country. And there have been concerns about the stigmatization of truck drivers and also the impact that this would have obviously over trading activities, given that already the informal sector have been affected tremendously by these issues. And there are a number of trading activities informally as well in some of the border areas. I think the concerns are, given the dire consequences, socioeconomic consequences, how do we make sure that we don't add further damage in terms of how states engage in these processes?
Thank you very much. Tony, over to you quickly, if you will. A comment that suggests that the majority of deaths worldwide is due to homicides in countries not currently in war. And how can we work towards peace building in these high violence areas?
Oh, well, I mean, that is a critical, very interesting, but I mean, almost insoluble problem. I mean, where you got where there's high homicide is concentrated generally in which aren't at war. It's generally in urban areas with gang warfare. I mean, I've got to say the current attempts to limit those conflicts have been not very successful. And I don't mean to, I know there's been some very great optimism, which I appreciate from Chuck and Tim, but I got to say, I think the urban environment is going to be a tough one. And I think that both in terms of positive engagement with those communities and also policing of them, I think is going to look quite stressful out for the next 3 to 5 years. So I'm not, if we move down from warfare to homicide, I'm fairly pessimistic. I think we are about to go through quite a difficult phase in history.
Thanks very much. Chuck Hall, I'm going to turn to you for the last question before we go on to implications for policy. Questions coming in about Minneapolis and the dismantling of the policing structure there. What, in your view, is a viable alternative for public safety in Minneapolis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there already, so in Minneapolis, first of all, because of reforms that have taken place in Minneapolis in the last several years, it's not something I'm an expert on, but something I've learned about in the last several days. Communities there have already begun essentially carrying out roles that were considered to be roles that the police had been or should be playing. And so what you have are people who go out and are making sure that services are being delivered. They're making sure that people are protected in protests, et cetera. But I think the investment in programs, I think what we're talking about here is, if we're talking about shifting resources, going over from policing to social services to people who are monitoring and supporting people who are vulnerable populations, who are groups that are doing mediation between discontented groups. We have a lot of community groups that have done a lot of this, including a lot of former gang members in American cities who have pioneered reconciliation among these. If we could do those, I think that those are very positive and promising alternatives to investing in heavily militarized and cultures of policing. And I think that's, so I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Chuck. We've got to turn to my last question now, which is to all of you very, very quickly, please. Policymakers are in the audience today. What is your very quick issues for them to consider at the moment? Julia Welland, start with you.
So very quickly, I would just want policymakers to pay attention to what feminists and critical race scholars have been saying for a long time, which is to take their lead from those in the most marginalized and most vulnerable positions in society, and not to exacerbate the traumas they're already experiencing. And I would really encourage them to look at the Feminist Alliance for Rights have published a statement on a feminist COVID-19 policy, which has concrete policy recommendations for governments across the globe on what can be done for these marginalized communities.
Thanks very much. Tim Donais, 15 seconds.
Well, as the only Canadian on the panel, allow me to be a little bit parochial. If Canada loses its bid to be on the Security Council in the next week or so, and I continue to believe that we will, I'd like to see Canada use this as an opportunity to commit itself to a full foreign policy review and do a thorough reflection on how Canada can actually make a real contribution to reducing conflict and increasing security in the world in the coming decades.
Great. Tony King.
Well, we started with Interstate War, so let me start with that. I would say some increased and intensified negotiations. That may be easier if Trump loses the election in November. That may be easier between China and the USA. In terms of internally, we've started to talk about it already. I think then there's going to need to be, as a result of budgetary and social costs of COVID, I think there's going to need to be a new policing strategy. I think there's going to be a requirement for increased engagement with certain, especially urban communities across the world. And so those would be my two recommendations.
Okay, we're down to one each for Chuck and Solomon. Chuck, what's yours?
I would echo much of what Julia had said, but basically with the idea that we need desperately to look at lessons that we can find from other places that revolve around consulting and involving communities in finding solutions and approaches to their own problems.
Great. So diversity-based analysis going forward. Solomon, finish us off.
Yeah, so two things. First is really damage control. I think controlling and limiting the scale of the damage is extremely important. And to this end, one of the areas that I'm concerned about and that is really worrying is to ensure that emergency measures are not institutionalized, so that they are time-bound and we go back to where we were in terms of the scale of authority that the executive power exercises on society, and all the check and balances are instituted fully. I think that's extremely important. And finally, I think I echo the point that have been made, which is rethinking about peace and security and the focus on peace and security. We need to bring in the soft security issues to the center of peace and security analysis and peace and security policy making, which means that we need to worry and feel concerned more about healthcare, more about climate change, more about the issues that COVID had accentuated, such as those relating to inequality, particularly in terms of access to social services such as water, education, sanitation, and housing. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, and thank you to all of the panelists today for a great discussion. I'm sure the audience will agree it was just super. I'd like everybody to tune into us with us next week for an equally exciting discussion on intelligence, surveillance, and democracy. Same day, same link, same time. Thank you again. Stay safe, stay well, and stay united.